Hello Internet, Seth Skorkowski, and today we'll be taking a look at the Call of Cthulhu adventure, Crimson Letters. Written by Alan Bligh, the adventure appears in the 7th edition Call of Cthulhu rulebook to serve as an introduction scenario to Call of Cthulhu. Coming in at 20 pages, the adventure is pretty short. The PCs are hired by Miskatonic University to investigate a mysterious death and locate some missing documents. It's a very sandboxy adventure in that there's no set order that they have to do anything to solve the case. It just simply gives them the case and lets them go. However, it also includes a ticking time clock aspect and several NPCs that the keepers can use to give a little bit of urgency or push the investigation back on track if they end up kind of wandering off in the desert a little bit, or just have them serve as a foil to the investigators. But the most interesting part of this adventure is that the game master gets to decide who the bad guy is. Instead of a set plot of, this person is the thief who did the crime, and now the players have to solve and figure out who that person is, Crimson Letters offers us a cast of suspects, each with their own reasons to have committed the crime, and before the session, the keeper decides which of them is the guilty party. This gives the scenario a lot of versatility, though I'm not going to call it replayability, because there are a lot of factors that are set in the scenario, so players who have already played it once using one of the suspects as the culprit, they're going to walk in that second time even if you change the culprit, and they're already going to know a significant number of the surprises already. In addition to its mystery and its multiple choice villains, we get mobsters, the living dead, a new mythos monster, and some old favorite mythos monsters. The adventure took us 2 sessions to complete, though we got most of that completed during the first session itself. So when the second session rolled around, I'd add a good deal of stuff to it in order to fill the whole time that we were wanting to play, but we did it and we had a lot of fun. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to offer my tips, my criticisms, as well as show how it was that I set it up and how it played out when I ran this scenario for my group.
And I'm Jack the NPC. I'm here to give it to you from a player's side of things as I get to relive the most insane chase scene that we have ever played.
But before we continue, I must warn you that there will be spoilers. Hot, juicy spoilers. So any players in the audience, please stop here. Send your game masters this way to see about running Crimson Letters for you. But if you keep going and you spoil yourself, don't come back to me complaining how your keeper has since offered to run you through this and now you can't play in it because you watched my video and it's your fault that you lack self-control. Okay, keepers, let's get this thing started. The backstory is that 9 months ago, the elderly recluse Joshua Hobhouse died. His estate passed on to his distant relatives who have asked Miskatonic University to go through Hobhouse's extensive library and collection of historic papers and assess what all among that was of value. Among them was the Arkham witch trial papers, records from the notorious witch trials there centuries before, including pages and alchemical formulae written by the infamous child killer Keziah Mason. The university assigned Professor Charles Leader as having full control of the project, but what no one knew about Leader is that he was a gambling addict and he was funding his habit through the forgery and sale of historic documents. However, a recent trip to Atlantic City has left him deeply indebted to the mob, so once word got out that he had access to the witch trial papers, a bidding war began for them, and Leader started sensing that someone might be following them. He even had his house broken into by Anthony Flinders, who was hoping to find the papers. Leader passed the documents to his forger, a former art student named Cecil Hunter. Hunter, however, while a gifted artist, didn't understand the formulae that he was copying, and he accidentally unleashed a mythos entity bound to the ink. Discovering his forger is raving mad, Leader had him committed to Arkham Asylum, but when he returned to Hunter's apartment to collect the papers, Leader discovered that someone had broken in and stolen them. The horror and ink that Hunter had accidentally released began seeking out whoever it was that had handled the witch trial papers, and eventually it's going to break free from the papers, causing a massive amount of destruction before it flees this world. His paranoia rising and strange occurrences now happening all around him as this monster began closing in, Leader tried to flee town. Last week, he visited his office late at night to collect any valuables and destroy any evidence of his crimes. However, before he could finish his work, the horror and ink manifested and possessed his body. As a final act of defiance, Leader forced himself to look into the mirror, and his own gaze attack, came back at him and burned out his soul. His body was discovered the next morning by Amelia Court, one of his grad students. Dean Fallon, worried of a scandal, had the university Dr. Wheatcroft handle the autopsy and declare his death a heart attack. Meanwhile, Fallon and Professor Harlan Roach went through Leader's office, discovering evidence of his illicit activities and that the witch trial papers were missing. After a week of rumors and the family inquiring about the status of the papers, when they're going to get those back because they don't know that they're missing, Dean Fallon has called in the player characters, hoping that the papers can be located before the university has to admit what happened and, avoiding a scandal by all that. Now, for all of this, the module gives us a timeline of events, and while it's set in the 1920s, the specific year is up to the keeper in order to help them work this into their campaign. It covers February through October 1st, when the investigators are brought in, with everything after that being up to the players and the game master to decide what happens next. Instead of a list of locations and encounters that the player characters will have there, the bulk of the adventure is detailed NPC profiles, so game masters are going to need to familiarize themselves with each of these characters. The module gives us several NPCs to interview: Dean Fallon, Dr. Wheatcraft, Leader's girlfriend Lucy Stone, and Hunter, the now insane forager. Other NPCs may be the thief who stole the papers, Amelia Court, the graduate student who discovered Leader's body, Professor Roach, a professional rival who also discovered proof of Leader's forgery operation, but didn't share that he had discovered that with the Dean and hopes of using that information to his advantage later on. Anthony Flinders, a handsome undergraduate and a secret Satanist who offers to aid the investigators in order to thwart their investigation and hopefully steal the papers for himself.
Or as we like to call him, Stupid Flinders.
It was also Flinders who broke into and ransacked Leader's home shortly before he died. Finally, Abner Wick, a local antique dealer who had wanted to purchase the witch trial papers. Abner is also a partial ghoul, a change not visibly apparent yet, but he does have 2 ghouls under his command.
Wait, so he is a cannibalistic ghoul, but he is not the villain?
Well, he is villainous, but if the keeper decides not to make him the thief in this adventure, they can keep him around as sort of a recurring NPC in future adventures, helping the player characters out with different things, all the while hiding his desire to consume human flesh, kind of like Hannibal. Next, we get Oaks and Shanassi, a pair of mafia goons sent from Atlantic City to collect Leader's dead and verify that he's really dead. Now, these two can serve as your wild card and red herring, something that could pop up and inject a little bit of action from time to time. And finally, the Horror and Ink, the ancient entity trying to escape the papers and is murdering everybody who comes in contact with them. The investigators aren't going to have much of an opportunity to deal with this monster until they find out who stole the papers and then get the papers back, but until then, it's going to be causing strange happenings and supernatural events as it's growing stronger and it's getting closer and closer to breaking out of its bonds.
Now, this is one of those interesting parts. You see, the investigators are originally hired just to find these missing papers, but the whole time they're doing this, there's a bunch of weird stuff going on around here, like some burst of cold wind, or the lights flickering in a room, or maybe their car's not starting, maybe a little bit of a witch fire glowing in the dark, or maybe somebody thrashing about and dying painfully and then rising back to life as the living dead with demonic fire glowing in their eyes, little stuff like that. But once the investigators do get the papers and they return those to the dean, they're going to discover that they themselves have been marked for death by this monster. So now they got to either steal or borrow those papers back to get that curse off of them before the Horror and Ink can do its worst.
Once the investigators get the job and they're given the names of a few NPCs that they can talk to, each of those can lead to more NPCs until the player characters have met the entire cast. In Dr. Wheatcroft's morgue, the investigators can see Leader's corpse, his face frozen in horror and his eyes being boiled in their sockets. The least likely suspect to come up in conversation is Abner Wick, the hopeful buyer of the papers, but a day or so after the investigation starts, if they haven't met him yet, Wick is going to invite the characters to a dinner party where he offers his assistance, but also expresses interest in maybe purchasing the papers once they find him.
Hold on. So Dean Fallon told us that in order to prevent a scandal, he wasn't going to tell anybody that he had hired us on to do this case, because nobody should find out that those papers were stolen by a possible forger. So if he didn't tell anybody about this case, and we certainly hadn't told anybody about this, how in the hell did you find out that we got hired for this job?
If the PCs ask him the way mine did, Wick simply shrugs and he says that he pays well to be informed of any happenings, and his success as a business comes from being able to see patterns and events that other people might only see as being unrelated, such as calls from the dean's office to the university switchboard, trying to get the numbers for the investigators, followed by them coming to the campus to meet with the dean, and then them visiting the campus morgue, or the university police being told that they're given authorization to go in Leader's home. So no one directly betrayed the dean, but Wick could see those connections and kind of put two and two together. We get a map for Wick's antique shop and its hidden entrance to the ghoul warrens, and a map of Leader's cottage. However, one thing that we don't get is handouts. For example, 2 suggested clues in the cottage are a receipt for the new locks after the break-in, and a letter about Hunter's admission to Arkham Sanitarium, both of which are partially visible on the map, meaning that we can't give the players this map until after they found those 2 items. But the images of those clues are partially covered up by the map, so now we have a map that we can't give to our players until they find the clues, but we don't have any clues that aren't covered up partially by the map, meaning that both of them are not that useful. Also, we lack maps for Leader's office, the Roadhouse, and Hobhouse Mansion. The adventure makes it sound like it's doing you a favor by not fleshing this out, allowing keepers to figure out what its secrets and its contents are, but I don't buy that myself. A keeper can always modify what has been given them inside of a published adventure module, but the adventure module should at least give us the basic floor plan that a keeper can then build on, so they're not required to build all of that themselves if that's what they just want to use. Now for Hobhouse Manse, I simply took the Fitzgerald Mansion from my Mansions of Madness book and filed off the name and used that, though I didn't make this pretty map for it when I ran the adventure. That was done later on after the adventure when one of our player characters decided to purchase the house.
What can I say? It was a fixer-upper opportunity. Besides, the price on that place was incredibly low, especially after that woman's body had been discovered on the property. Police is still trying to figure out that one.
Another location that's not touched on at all is Cecil Hunter's studio apartment where the papers were stolen from. There's nothing mentioned as far as possible clues that we could find there. Maybe partially half-completed forgeries or clues about who stole the papers, such as footprints outside the window, or maybe traces of blood and broken glass in the window frame. Now, these locations are mentioned in the section discussing manifestations of the horror in ink, specifically sightings of the witch fire around the place that the papers have been, but nothing more is given about them, and I find that pretty irritating. Now, when it comes to the handouts, one thing that I used when I ran this adventure was one fan, Ivo Eduardo Zanin, has made a collection of very nice handouts available in DriveThruRPG. Some even come with several alternate versions, depending on how the keeper wishes to use them. I used several of these when I ran the adventure, and I do highly recommend them. Keepers are going to want to go through them first to decide which ones they want. They might not want to use all of them, but some of them you might be given up to 4 different types of them, so they'll have to choose which of those 4 they're going to use. Now, also the dates in them are set at 1920, so keepers be aware if you are planning on setting it in a different year in the 20s that the dates are all going to be wrong. Now, finally, my big complaint with this adventure is that while I do like the horror in ink serving as our supernatural monster, and I think it's pretty cool, and there's a few suggestions of how the player characters might deal with this monster, there really isn't any suggestions as to how the player characters are going to learn how to deal with the monster outside of having Wick just simply tell them that he's able to do it, or a spontaneous use of the Cthulhu mythos, which I see as more of a last resort backup than the actual plan that you should have going into the adventure for solving the problem. I don't know. It just seems like you're planning on just using the airbags to stop the car instead of just acknowledging that your brakes are beginning to go out. Maybe you should have your brakes fixed. So my recommendation here is to have the investigators be able to discover something inside the papers themselves if they give them an initial read, or if they don't have the papers yet anymore because they've already they haven't found them or they've already returned them to the dean. They might find the solution to banish the monster inside the partial forgeries that Cecil had made, so they can maybe see the full instructions or maybe half the instructions. Enough to let them know that those instructions are inside the papers. Or maybe you could have it where when they visit Cecil in the sanitarium, scare him, he scratched that information in the walls of his cell. So the player characters are going to have to go inside his cell and copy all that down as far as how to banish this monster. Another way, this is the way that I did it when I ran the adventure, is to use Evo Zanon's handouts. I offered two versions of the spell to banish the monster. The first was hidden inside Hop House Mansion, the Cave of the Ceremony, but that required destroying the papers in the process. The second was in Abner Wick's lair, and it was the version that didn't require that you burned the papers up in the process, meaning that you could keep the papers and be able to give those back to the dean once the monster had been destroyed.
And finally, this is Miskatonic University here. I mean, they got freaking Mythos tomes over in the library. Yeah, of course, the investigators are going to have to figure out how they're going to get access to the forbidden book section, but hey, that is their problem in order to deal with that. The point is that the investigators should have some means in order to research this monster and figure out a way of breaking this curse before the horror and ink can break free of those papers and do its worst to them.
Okay, so because this adventure can go a lot of different ways, let me show you how our group did this when we ran the adventure, and maybe some keepers can kind of see what it was that I did, maybe use that, or maybe build upon that themselves. Also, I ran this using the Pulp Cthulhu mod, so the characters had pulp talents, and I beefed up Abner Wick to full pulp villain status. Now, before the game, I decided that the culprit was going to be Amelia Court. I also decided to go with the idea that was suggested that she was a sorceress and a descendant from Keziah Mason. I also beefed up her stats to full pulp villain as well. I also printed up several items in the handout pack that I thought would be pretty useful for us during the course of the adventure. The first session, the heroes arrived at Miskatonic to meet with Dean Fallon. On the way to his office, they experienced a sudden wind and temperature drop, a sign of the monster's presence. Now, after meeting Dean Fallon, they met Amelia Court and Search Leader's office, discovering Wick's business card and a love letter from Lucy. One of our characters, who has the clairvoyance pulp talent, tried to detect any unseen mythos entities. Now, she ended up botching the roll, so what she saw was a red aura with black worm-like feelers that were in the cabinet that the papers had previously been stored in, the mirror, and family around Amelia, who had handled the papers for her job, and then later on she had stolen them. Because the psychic player also botched the roll, she saw the invisible horror emerging from the wall, blindly reaching for Amelia.
Ah! Oh, no one else saw that? Never mind.
Later they met with Roach and learned of Leader's forgery enterprises. Then they met Dr. Wheatcroft and inspected Leader's body, which had a very strong aura from the horror that the investigator had seen earlier. They then visited Leader's house, discovered the locksmith receipt, the burned journal entry, the bill for Atlantic City, paperwork for Cecil Hunter's commitment to the sanitarium, and a telegram from Wick. They also discovered Leader's safe with a stash of money, and a good spot roll made them aware that they were being watched.
Hold up, guys. There is some creepy preppy dude out there watching the house. I say we go out there and say hello to him.
And that's how they met Anthony Flinders, who claimed that he was hoping to help them out with this investigation. He also unloaded a ton of crazy theories, like how Dean Fallon and Professor Roach were secret lovers conducting black magic rituals. But during this discussion, an ID roll notified one of the investigators that they had noticed Flinders following them earlier that day. They just hadn't realized that at the time.
Yeah, okay, weirdo. We'll definitely keep the mole men in mind as possible suspects for who stole those papers. And yeah, sure, Amelia Court is really a secret millionaire witch. Tell you what, why don't you just go on home and we'll call you if we need you for anything else. Stupid Flinders.
The investigators then visited Lucy's stone at the Roadhouse, and again, using their clairvoyance, detected the corrupted aura that she'd interacted with the papers. However, they also failed the rolls to detect that she was nervous because mafia goons from Atlantic City had paid her a visit, looking to verify if Leader was really dead or if he was just faking it to get out of his debt. Now, leaving the Roadhouse, the player characters are confronted by the two mafia goons, demanding that they needed proof of Professor Leader's demise, so the investigators brought them to the university, and after some killer fast talk rolls to get them inside, showed them Leader's body, which then set up off the slab and attacked them. They managed to destroy the zombie, but not before it had torn off one of the mafia goons' ears. Convinced that Leader was definitely dead, they returned to Atlantic City and out of the adventure forever. That evening, they received a dinner invitation from Abner Wick. The next morning, two of the characters discovered that someone had broken into their house on the previous day and stolen all the loose hair out of their brushes. Now that, of course, was Flinders, hoping to cast a spell on them, but the player characters didn't know that yet. They just knew that somebody had broken in and stolen their hair. And out of my 4 player characters, Flinders had managed to get the hair from 3 of them, and 2 of those 3 were definitely aware that somebody had done this to them. Next, they visited Cecil Hunter in the asylum, and with their clairvoyance, they could tell the red and wormy aura that was very strong around him, the strongest they'd seen so far. Near the end of that interview, one of the characters heard whispers coming from a nearby cell, and when he stepped away to investigate that, it ended up being an empty cell that those whispers were coming from. The horror and ink manifested and took over Hunter's body.
Holy crap, I am not sure what part of that was worse, the demonic glowing eyes, or the fact that he was crab walking backwards up the freaking walls.
I may have taken a few liberties with what it was the possessed bodies could do just for the sake of it being freaking awesome. That evening they had dinner with Wick, and he confessed to know some of the mythos, and he confirmed that the player character's suspicions that contact with the papers binds you to the monster that's trying to escape them, and if that's left unchecked, the monster would escape, causing mass destruction. By the way, there's not really a set spot in the scenario where you can inform the characters of that information. So, keepers, if you don't want to use Wick as a way to warn them all that information about the monster, I suggest having that information be somewhere that the player characters can discover it during the course of the adventure. Now, after dinner, they swung by Cecil Hunter's apartment looking for any clues there. One of the player characters noticed that one of the windows had been jimmied open, so he stepped out the back door to search for any tracks or any clues that were outside the window. Now, he failed his roll, and then he failed the push roll on his tracked check, so I decided that while he was so intently looking at the ground, he didn't notice that Flinders was sneaking up behind him with a rock, and he was planning on knocking him out and stealing some of his hair. Unfortunately for Flinders, he failed to incapacitate the player character, and he was now facing one angry hero and 3 more rushing outside in response to the cries that he had given, so Flinders decided that he should run.
And so began the wackiest chase scene that we have ever played. It started off pretty small, like 5 location markers. It says you know what, if he makes it past the 5th location marker and nobody has caught him yet, he's gonna get away. Well, that ain't how that worked out at all. Now, the first obstacle we faced was this wooden fence, like a 6-foot tall wooden fence, right? A single skill check, you can get past the freaking thing. Well, the first character, he tried to climb over it and ended up falling off on the other end and hurting himself. And the next character, she got her clothes caught on that thing because she was wearing that nice dress because we had just had dinner with Wick. Anyways, that ended up pulling the entire fence down and nearly smacking the guy that was just lying on the ground right there. Now, the 3rd and 4th characters, they were able to just go right past it because there wasn't no fence in their way anymore at all. So we finally caught up with him right at the time he was at the 5th location mark, and it's just yeah, he didn't get away because, clearly you're in the same location that he's in, so he just kept adding more and more location markers along the way. Whole time, though, we are slipping in the mud. One of the characters gets clipped by a freaking milk truck. Don't worry about him, he's okay. And every time we tried to catch him, twice, somebody was able to get a hold of him, get a good grip on his shirt or something like that, but they didn't have enough time to be able to get a good punch in and knock him out or really grapple him, and Flinders managed to weasel out of their arms and kept on running. Anyway, so somewhere around location marker 20 or something like that, that's when one of the characters managed to get a hold of him and keep a hold of him long enough for another character to come up. And he had a pipe, and he was just going to smack Flinders upside the head and knock his ass out, maybe teach him a little bit of a lesson about giving us this difficult time trying to catch him. Anyways, that's not how that worked out at all. That character had a bonus die just to hit Flinders because Flinders was held in place, and he still rolled 100 on that attack roll, meaning a 1 out of 1,000 chance. So he hit the character that was holding Flinders and knocked his ass out, and Flinders just kept on running. Anyway, somewhere around location 22, 23, something like that, Flinders finally failed a dex check and he slipped in the mud, and that gave us enough time in order to catch him. And that's when the interrogation began.
Interrogating Flinders didn't really get much information other than simply rule him out as being the thief of the papers, but he also knew where it was that Amelia Court lived, saying that it was this fancy townhouse, this brownstone, because he'd also been stalking her as well. Now, one thing that I added about Flinders is beneath his big poofy sweater, he has this huge pentagram and other designs that he's scarred into his chest. So when they kind of peeled off his sweater and they looked underneath, he was completely covered in scars from the neck down.
Holy crap! I have battled real cultists with real magic. I have seen alien gods, the mere sight of which would shatter a lesser man's mind. I have been to other realms of existence. I've been to alternate timelines, both the future and the past. But you, some sort of self-proclaimed Satanist that doesn't know jack about squat, you're the one that's been giving us this much trouble? I seriously hate this stupid Flinders.
After dropping him off at the police station because he had assaulted one of the player characters, that ended up wrapping up the first session that we played it. Now at this point, the player characters had already completed a great majority of the adventure, so before the next session, I decided to add a few more details to kind of pad it a little bit so we could use the full time. First, I decided to give Amelia a homunculus, a flying little spy that could follow the player characters around. I also decided that Abner Wick's two ghouls would follow them around as well, watching the player characters from the shadows in the sewer grates, and in which the PCs then started seeing glimpses of them as they were moving around location to location throughout that second session. The session opened with a news story that Lucy Stone had been found dead overnight in the home of Professor Leader, and then talking to campus security after that, it learned that she was trying to skip town because she had all of her luggage inside of her car, and she was dead beside the open safe that the player characters had discovered Leader's money in. So she was showing up at the house trying to get some money to skip town, but all of a sudden the Horror and Ink showed up and killed her. Now, the cops also told the player characters that somebody had come in and stolen the body from the morgue because it was reported to be missing from the morgue that morning. They then went and checked Amelia's brownstone over at the wealthy part of town, but she wasn't home. Now, one of the player characters caught a glimpse of something watching them from the sewers, but they weren't able to discover anything when they went to check that out. And then they spied the homunculus flying away from the house, so they decided to follow that. And it took several spot rolls and drive checks in order to track it as it's flying, and they're trying to follow the roads while keeping an eye on this thing. But eventually that led them to Hobhouse Manor. They found Amelia there, who was searching the place for any documents on how to remove this curse from the papers, but she still claimed that she didn't have them, but she had been able to figure out that there was this curse.
Oh, well, since you seem trustworthy, I believe you. That must mean that Wick is the one that stole those papers, and that creepy bat monkey thing we saw earlier has got to be his. Anyway, Wick has told us that he has a way of removing that curse. So tell you what, why don't you join us and go into Wick's shop and, let's wrap this case up.
Before they could leave, a sign of passage occurred, and the batteries of both Amelia and the player characters' cars were dead. They eventually got their car started, and all of them piled in with Amelia. Now, as they loaded into the car, they spotted the undead Lucy Stone coming toward them. One of the player characters went insane, and they ran out of the car and fled screaming into the house. But between the bullets and then running her over with the car a couple times, they managed to kill Lucy. Now, one of the investigators, they went inside the house to, find their insane friend, and that kind of engaged them in a wacky chase. But that left Amelia alone in the car with one of the other player characters, and she decided to take that opportunity to cast mental suggestion on the character, hoping to get a little bit of control or be able to manipulate the PC. But the character ended up making their POW roll and realized that what Amelia was doing, and Amelia was trying to cast a spell on her, so a fight broke out, and Amelia immediately cast the fear spell, which sent the character then running out of the car and fleeing into the house. This led to another merry chase through the house, but this time the insane character found a secret door in the wall, and they were kind of chasing him as this character's moving around through the walls. And once they finally found the character, they were inside of a secret room with several boxes of documents, including the means of breaking the curse, but also destroying the witch trial papers in the process. Unfortunately, by the time they had managed to get that player character calmed down, they could hear the car roaring outside because Amelia had stolen their car because they had fixed the battery for it, so now they were trapped at the house with only Amelia's broken car. Eventually, the player characters managed to get back to town. Once they got to Amelia's place, they discovered that she was brutally murdered, and there was a puddle of goo in one corner that had previously been that homunculus because it melted away when it had died. But when they searched the house, they were able to confirm that Amelia was a witch that was descended from one of the people in the Arkham witch trials from 2 centuries before, and that she was the one who had stolen the papers from Cecil Hunter's apartment. But the papers themselves were gone. They were nowhere to be found. There were also bloody hoof prints on the floor, and those were from the ghouls, and they had gone out the back door and down a manhole cover, but the player characters, they tried to follow those hoof prints, and they ended up losing the trail somewhere in the sewers. Convinced that Wick was behind it, they visited his shop the next day, claiming they had some important business in order to procure some antique clock. That was actually a side quest that one of the other player characters was doing at the same time. But once they got in there, they were able to convince Wick to send his counter girl off for the day, kind of an extended lunch. And once they were alone with him in the shop, they tried subduing Wick. Now this led to a huge fight with him and the ghouls, and eventually the player characters managed to defeat them and found the papers, as well as Wick's version of the spell that didn't require that the papers would be destroyed. They then kinda, sorta, not really well, cleaned up all the blood from the place, and they got the hell out of there. Afterward, they did the ceremony to banish the monster, and they returned the papers to the school. The local ghouls, learning of Wick's death, decided to burn down his shop, and they collapsed the entrance to the ghoul warrens underneath Arkham. That way nobody would be able to discover exactly how extensive Arkham is with ghouls living underneath it. So as you can see, I ended up adding and adapting quite a lot when we ran this adventure. Certain parts, such as the handouts and the maps, I prepared all of that before we actually played it. And that came from me, having years and years of experience as a keeper and knowing what to expect before the adventure began. Overall, while I did enjoy the adventure and we did have a lot of fun playing it, I don't see the Crimson Letters as being a good scenario for a novice keeper to run. Being that it's in the Keeper Guide, I think a lot of new keepers are going to just try their hand at running it because it's there and it's a free adventure, and they're going to end up running into a few problems because they don't have that experience to warn them about all that beforehand. And it was for that reason that I never ran the adventure when I first started playing Call of Cthulhu until I had several years of being a keeper under my belt already. I like the fact that it does focus on NPCs and how a keeper should, handle and them having them react to all the investigators' actions versus simply just listing out a bunch of locations that the investigators can go to and what happens at each of those locations. So it is much more sandboxy than a lot of other investigations because it's focused more on the NPCs rather than the places. However, it also doesn't help that much. It doesn't provide us any clue handouts or many maps for the locations, such as the artist's studio or the mansions, or recommendations on how the investigators can learn how to destroy this curse. Even little things are laid out a little bit weird in this scenario, such as the payment amount for the job is mentioned at the very end of the adventure, even though that's going to be something that the players are going to ask about at the very beginning when they meet with Dean Fallon. The scenario throws a lot of neat ideas at the keepers, such as, these are the people who could be guilty, and you get to decide. But it focuses so much on, hey, it's your game, make this game yours, that it doesn't really offer us that many concrete things that a keeper can use, especially an inexperienced keeper can use. So to me, it feels incomplete, and it feels like it's trying to sell you on the idea that those missing parts are features, but an inexperienced keeper might not see those missing details until they're already in the middle of the game, and now they're panicking because they don't know what to do. So any keepers wanting to run this adventure, expect to put a lot of prep into it beforehand and know your material before you even attempt it. And not just figuring out who the culprit is, but also what clues you plan to sprinkle around in the different locations in order to lead the investigators to the solution. And not just the solution to the theft, but of the horror and ink and how to stop this monster. Now once again, I highly recommend Evo's handout pack for this adventure. It's on DriveThruRPG as pay what you want, and I think it's definitely worth a few bucks. I have a link down in the video description below. I suggest that you check that out.
Hey, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a thumbs up. If you want to see some more of our stuff, such as game reviews, or how-tos, or some of the more really weird videos that Seth puts out every once in a while, just hit that subscribe button. Till next time, gamers, you have a great day. I put a bid on an Emily Court's old brownstone. After the brutal killing that was discovered there, that price was dirt cheap. I couldn't say no to it. While other Call of Cthulhu characters are always burning the house down to hide the evidence, I started snatching them up. Every property I get's got some sort of quirk. Bleeding walls or the phantom ghost girl that's crying in the hallway every night. But you cannot beat those prices.